Hi everyone, my name is Ida. I'm here to teach basic soap making with 4 household ingredients. I need to apologize for my big headset. This helps to keep the echoing down on my end of things, so that's why I wear that. So we are going to make Bastille soap today, and that is a variation of Castile soap, which has been dated to period or very late period. There are recipes that are extant. I don't have any of those to share with you. The thing is that Castile soap, hailing from, we believe, the Castile region of Spain, is just olive oil and lye. That is it. All soap is just oils or fats of some kind and lye. And when we say lye, there are really 2 different kinds of lye that we could be talking about. There is, let's see, I think it's sodium hydroxide, which is the kind of lye that we're going to be using today. This makes a hard sort of bar-like soap. That's what we think of usually when we think of soap. There is also potassium hydroxide, or if you prefer, you can think of that as potash. So you can get that also from the ashes of hardwood. And I think that is sort of a more, an older, more period way to create soap. It does not make a hard soap. It makes a soft soap. So you think like a liquid soap or like a soap that you might keep in a jar and kind of scoop out and use. So that's the kind of soap that makes. And the way I remember the difference is that potassium hydroxide starts with the word pot, and this is also known as potash or hardwood ash. Again, we're going to be using sodium hydroxide today. All lye is very corrosive. It's very dangerous. So we do have some safety precautions that we're going to take, and I urge all of you to not only follow my advice with what I'm going to show you today, but also maybe look up some videos on your own too if you have not worked with lye before, if you're not sure what kinds of safety precautions you might need to take. So get your information from different sources. The first thing that I want to make sure that we do when we are working with lye is we want to have long sleeves. And the reason for that is that once we start to blend the lye water with the fats and the oils, it could splosh up and hit us. And we want to make sure that we have long sleeves. And I am guilty of this a couple weeks ago. It's like already hot here in Atenveldt. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to mix up some soap. And I feel pretty confident. So I just wore my short sleeves. And after I had blended the soap, I started to feel sort of an itchy, burning rash right here. And that is because as I was holding my blender, of course, tiny, minuscule droplets had sprayed up onto the underside of my arm. And so I was able to wash that off pretty quickly, but you can burn yourself pretty badly if you're not careful. You also want to have closed-toed shoes for kind of the same reasons. What if you spill something? And then finally, you want to have eye protection of some sort. And I know that I have glasses, but I also usually put on some of these guys. They're super attractive and also just extremely comfortable. They're not really, but safety. And then you also really need to have gloves of some kind. I like nitrile gloves if you can find them. They're getting harder to find right now, but you could also use rubber dishwashing gloves, provided that they are a good fit on your hand. You don't have the fingers like kind of way up flopping around as you're trying to work, because those will get caught on things. And provided that they don't have any little tears or holes in them, because again, that's another way for some of this corrosive lye or even the raw soap batter to get in onto your skin and to be trapped between your hand and your glove. You don't want that. So I'm going to go ahead and glove up, and the recipe that I'm going to be using for Bastille soap. So I talked about Castile soap being just olive oil. Bastille soap traditionally is just olive oil and coconut oil. So we've got olive oil, coconut oil, we've got sodium hydroxide or lye, which is easy to get. You can get it at the, like at the Ace, at a hardware store. It's usually by the like with the drain decloggers, you want to make sure that it is 100% sodium hydroxide, 100% lye. You can also order it online. You can find it pretty cheaply if you order it online, cheaper than you're going to find it at the Ace, honestly. And you want to use distilled water, and you really do want it to be distilled, and that is because our tap water can have all different kinds of municipal chemicals or minerals in it that can affect the outcome of our soap. So distilled water may be a little bit difficult for you to find at this point, just depending on where you are. I haven't had too much trouble finding it. We use it for a couple of different things in our household, and soap just being one of them. So those are the 4 ingredients that we're going to use to make this soap. Now, sort of traditionally, a Bastille soap is made with, I want to say 70% olive oil, and then the rest coconut oil. In this recipe, we're using 35% coconut oil, so a little bit higher. And the reason for that is that it's going to help give us a harder bar. That's going to make it easier, especially for brand new soap makers. The soap's going to come to trace. It's going to turn into batter, and it's going to turn into soap and go through the saponification process a little bit faster. It's also going to harden up in the mold and be easier to cut sooner. And it's going to take less time to cure. And curing is once it has gone through that saponification process. With the cold processed soap like we're making today, usually you want to let it cure for 4 to 6 weeks. That is a long time. It feels like a long time. But the alternative to that is that if it hasn't gone through that curing process, which is really a drying process, so all of the excess moisture and water that is in the soap is just sort of slowly evaporating out of it. Okay. If you don't let it go through that process and you start to use it, you run the risk of having a soap that is going to turn very soft, very gel-like, and it's just not going to last you nearly as long. And if you've ever bought a fancy handmade soap that hasn't gotten to cure completely and then had it sort of disintegrate within a week, then you know what that's like.
Disappointing.
So the Bastille soap is going to cure faster. If you are doing a Castile soap, that's a very soft soap. It's a very gentle soap. It also takes a lot longer to cure. So for a Castile soap, you really do want to let it cure for 6 months or longer, 6 months to a year. So that's a long time. So we're not going to do that. We're going to do something a little bit easier to start with. So that's our Castile soap, or I'm sorry, our Bastille soap. Now I went ahead and I mixed up my lye and my water yesterday. And there is a good reason for doing that. And that is that when you mix those 2 ingredients together, it starts a chemical reaction and it gets very hot. Within a few seconds, it will get up to 190, 200 degrees. And that's if you're starting with room temperature water. And you want to have time for that temperature to come down before you mix it into your soap. So I went ahead and I mixed mine up yesterday. You want to have a kitchen scale, right? And usually when I go ahead and I measure out my lye water, it's the first step that I do. And I have my protective equipment on. And what I like to do is take just a normal glass and then a sandwich bag, and I'll put that in the glass and kind of wrap the bag around the top. And that's just gonna give me a really easy place to pour my lye into. Household 100% lye drain opener. So I got this at Ace. You'd open it up and it's these tiny little crystals. And I would pour that in to this container. So for a 2-pound batch, and the reason for that, sorry, I'm kind of jumping around, is that you need a mold or something to pour your soap batter into at the end of all of this. And one really easy thing to use is, say, a quart, one of these, like just half and half. And all I've done is I've cut off that top of the container, the spout where it pours out. So this is a quart, 32 fluid ounces. That's 2 pounds. And so that's why I have a 2-pound recipe in your handout. What I'm going to be making today is actually 3 pounds because I have another mold that I'm going to be using because I've already used up my 2-pound mold over there. So this is how I would normally weigh the lye out, is, you know, tear this down so that your scale is at 0. And for a 2-pound batch, you're going to use 2.69 ounces, and you want to get as close to that as you can. All right. And then you want to have your container that you would put your water into. And for lye, I really recommend that you not ever use a glass container. Glass is very tempting because it is easy to clean. However, because of that very fast temperature change, going from, you know, room temperature up to 200 degrees in under 30 seconds, you run the risk of your glass shattering. Also, if you were to drop it and it were to break that way, then not only do you have corrosive lye everywhere, but you also have broken glass. So it's not a good idea. Instead, I recommend using some kind of plastic. And the kind of plastic that we're looking for is, and I don't know how well you can see it, but when you turn over a plastic vessel and you see that little, it kind of looks like the recycle symbol, you know, the triangle with the arrows, and there's a number inside of it, you are looking for the number 5. And below it, it says PP. And that is going to be a good kind of plastic that isn't going to slowly corrode under your lye. I actually, for my lye water, I use an old lye container. So that's another option. So I would put this on my scale. I'd measure out my water. For a 2-pound batch, it is going to be 7.28 ounces of water. And then I would take this whole thing outside. And I would very slowly add those lye crystals to the water. You never want to add water to the lye crystals. And that is because it could sort of explode. Like, you could really hurt yourself. So there's a little rhyme device that I've seen out in the soap making world. And it is something like, water to lye, you might die. Lye to water is what you oughter. So that's your little rhyme to remember how to mix your lye water up. And when you add those lye crystals in, it's going to, the water is going to turn cloudy. It's going to start to get very hot. It's also going to off-gas some very dangerous gases. And you don't want to be breathing that. You don't want to be anywhere where there are kids around or where there are pets. I always do this part outside. And then I use, always to mix it up, like a whisk. And I use a silicone whisk. You could also use a stainless steel whisk. So with your soap making tools, you always want to use a good plastic or silicone or stainless steel. Anything else, and you run the risk of the lye corroding it. So then I usually will let my lye water just kind of cool down overnight or for a few hours. You want it to be close to room temperature if you're going to make your soap at room temperature. So then what I normally do is measure out my oils. And when we talk about oils with soap making, there are 2 basic kinds of oils that we're talking about. We have our hard oils, which are things that are solid at room temperature, like coconut oil, which we're using today. Then we have our soft oils, and those are things that are generally liquid at room temperature, like olive oil, which we're also using today. So when I go ahead and I measure out my oils, I use just like an old yogurt container. This doesn't have to be lye safe because all that's going in it is our oils. And since I'm making a 3-pound batch, I'm going to use 20.28 ounces of oil. The 2-pound batch used 13.52 ounces of olive oil. So I put my container on and tear it out, and I'm not actually sure if I can fit a whole 20 ounces into this container. So I might have to do it in 2 batches.
Alrighty. Maybe.
Well, I think I can do it.
Yes, a little more. You can
Now,
You're such a great cheerleader, Poe.
You got it.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be right on the money. I think I kind of forgot to explain saponification earlier, which is basically that what the oil and the lye goes through in order to make soap. So every kind of oil has a different sap value, a different saponification value. And what that is basically how much lye per gram of oil do we need to completely convert that oil into soap. So if you had a perfectly balanced soap at the end of the saponification process, you would have no leftover oils and you would have no leftover lye. It's very important to have no leftover lye in your soap. However, because we are living creatures with sensitive skin, we actually don't want a perfectly balanced soap if we're going to be using it on our skin. It might be fine for like a laundry soap, but for us, it's not really. So instead, we always make sure that we have a little bit more oil in the soap than we, strictly speaking, need in order to achieve saponification. So we're going to have a little bit of leftover oil. That's going to be good for our skin when we put it on our skin. Typically speaking, a lot of home soap makers will do a 5%, and this is called a super fat. It might also be called a lye discount. So typically people will do like a 5% super fat. That's a pretty good number. For this soap that we're making, we're actually doing a 15% super fat. So it is going to be a little bit more gentle on our skin. And part of the reason for that is that coconut oil is not actually as great and moisturizing as we think it is. You can make soap out of just coconut oil, but you have to have a pretty high super fat in order for that to not be drying to your skin. And typically they say, you don't really want any more than 30% of coconut oil in the soap. And I apologize if any of you are allergic to coconut oil. Obviously, you can make soap without coconut oil, and I have done so for somebody who was allergic. Coconut oil does bring a lot of great stuff to the soap, though. It helps us get a harder bar, and it also makes some great bubbles. So I had already measured out my coconut oil for this soap, and I put it in my little stainless steel pot, and I melted it on the stove. And I did this a couple hours ago so that it wouldn't be still super hot by the time I wanted to mix my soap. So coconut oil will stay, this feels like it's almost at room temperature. It's probably a little bit above because it is still perfectly liquid. Okay. Coconut oil will cool down and stay liquid for quite a while. So I've mixed my olive oil into my coconut oil, and you can do this in advance as well, because the great thing about once you've mixed your oils together is that as long as you don't live in a place where you have a really low general room temperature, it's gonna stay liquid. So like I could save this and I could do this tomorrow, for example, and the coconut oil isn't going to separate out and harden up. It's going to stay this nice liquid. And you notice that it isn't cloudy at all. If your oils are cloudy, and this can especially sometimes happen if you're using a lot of different kinds of oils and you've got some specialty oils and you've got a higher percentage of hard oils in your recipe, you just want to heat it up a little bit more until it turns clear, because you want everything to be liquid. And if it's cloudy, that means that there are parts of the oil that are actually not a full liquid yet.
Gotcha.
All right, so let's see. Our next step is going to be to actually add the lye water and begin to mix the soap. You always want to make sure, for safety reasons, that you are not doing double duty with any of your equipment. So this immersion blender has been the soap blender, and it's never going to be a food blender again. I'm never going to use this for food. Nobody's ever going to use it for food. The same thing with this pot. I got this pot at the at Savers or something, and we're never going to use it for food. It's just going to be for soap. And the same thing with my soap spatulas and scrapers and all different kinds of things. They're all dedicated to soap making now. Theoretically, you could get these things clean enough that you could use it for food, but I just wouldn't recommend it. It just doesn't seem like a good idea. Okay, so I'm gonna introduce the mixer, and I'm gonna try to get as many of the air bubbles out as possible before I start to blend.
Mm-hmm.
And when I do start to blend, it's kind of a very satisfying thing that happens. So you want to be very careful as you pour your lye water in. You don't want any splashes. You're trying to avoid bubbles of any kind. And once it's in, I always put the lid back on my container, because if I were to accidentally knock it onto the floor and those little droplets of lye water were to fly out anywhere, I would be very sad. Okay, so I'm just gonna start to blend it on low, and it's gonna get really loud, and I apologize for that. Okay, so what we're looking for here is emulsification, and you, I don't know how well you can see on the camera, but it's still kind of, we're close, but I can still see a little bit of separation from the original oil. The other thing you can do is you can kind of look and you can see if the film on your blender is kind of separating a little bit. That's a sign that you're not quite at emulsification yet.
That looks so cool.
So we're getting pretty close. After emulsification, there is a phase called light trace. And what that means is that if we were to dribble, a little bit of the soap batter, we would be able to see a tiny amount of a trail left where those dribbles were. We don't have that yet. So we're at emulsification now. This is great if you are doing some like really fancy techniques with color and that kind of thing, and you need your soap to stay liquid for a long time. This is a great point to start working. But for this kind of soap, we're not going to be putting in any fancy color. We can go ahead and blend it and speed up this process a little bit more.
Now, what about fragrances? When do you add those?
Yes, I'm going to add some fragrance to this one just so that you can see what that process is like. I'm not going to bother with doing any colors. And of course, fragrances are completely optional. A lot of people are allergic to different things or they're sensitive to them. I don't generally have that problem, so I'm kind of a brat in terms of I always want my soap to be really smelly. Okay, I don't know if you can tell, but I can tell by looking at it that our soap batter is starting to thicken up a little bit more, and that's a good sign. This, we can continue to blend it until it gets thicker and thicker and starts to look more and more like pudding, but we certainly don't have to. So I'm going to go ahead and, in the interest of time, stop my blending here.
Okay.
And this is where I generally would add my fragrance oil. So I will do that. I do try to scrape as much of the soap batter off of my equipment as possible. And later on, when you wash your equipment, you can either wash it right away in very hot water with soap, or you can let it sit for a day, in which case it will turn into soap. Whatever residue is left will be soap. And you'll still want to use very hot water and probably a little bit of soap on it to get it cleaned. So you can do the lazy way where you let it turn into soap, or you can wash it right away. It's up to you. So at this point, I have an ounce of essential oils that I'm going to add to it. And
wow.
This is for a 3-pound batch of soap. Okay. And it's actually not going to be that strong after curing. One thing to keep in mind with fragrance oils is that they actually tend to get less strong over time.
Okay.
So let's say you have this soap and it's cured and you're keeping it in a drawer and slowly using it up over time. By the time you get to those last few bars, you're not going to have very much fragrance left, and that's okay. I also will use synthetic fragrance oils in my soaps too. Now I'm just going to kind of gently whisk that fragrance oil in. For this, I just use like half an ounce of lime essential oil and half an ounce of basil essential oil. So I think that will, by the time this has gone through its curing process, that'll be a nice summery smell, and it will be summer. If you were going to add colorants to your soap, this is kind of when you would do that, but we're not going to bother. So I'm bringing out this is my 3-pound mold that I bought on Amazon for like $12, and it came with 2 different kinds of soap cutters. I also forgot to mention that I very much recommend that you keep a soap making journal if you're going to start making soap. You can have your recipe written out, and particularly when you're measuring out your oils, you can kind of go down the list and check off each oil as you've added it, because if you were to get distracted and accidentally forget one of your oils, then you're going to have a soap that has too much lye in it for the amount of oils that you have, and you're not going to be able to use that soap really. So you can also make notes on your soap, like when it was made and when it should be done curing and how things went for you, and you can look back on it later on. So I very much recommend having something like that. Okay, so this is my little cheapy 3-pound silicone lined soap mold, and I'm just going to pour the whole thing in there. And feel free to pipe up if you have a question.
If you mess up your bar of soap, is there any way to salvage it, or is it just toast?
So it depends on what you've messed up. I have, and I will show you some examples. I've had a lot of soaps that have had sort of what I would call cosmetic failures, in which means that the design didn't turn out the way I wanted. It might look a little bit ugly. It wasn't what I was going for, but it's still fine. It's still soap. It still smells good. It's still usable. It just doesn't look the way I wanted it to. However, if you did have a soap that was heavy on lye or something like that, you could attempt to rebatch it. Oh. And usually you're going to do that with hot process and a
crock pot?
Yeah, a crock pot. Thank you. I have not ever made that kind of soap because, one, I don't want to dedicate a crock pot to soap at this point. And 2, with hot process soap, you have to sort of babysit it and stir it, because as the soap heats up and cooks, it's going to expand. And if you don't babysit it and stir it down, it will overflow your crock pot. So that doesn't sound like a ton of fun to me.
No.
But it might sound great to you. And the thing about hot process soaps is that they don't need quite as long of a curing time as cold process does, because that cooking process is cooking out some of the extra water that's in the soap.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah. So a lot of people who sell their homemade soaps, if you start to get into that world, you're going to get an eye for if it's a cold process soap or a hot process soap. Hot process soaps tend to have more of like an earthy, chunky look to them. So you'll be able to tell what you're looking at. Okay, so at this point,
what's the mold made out of? Is it silicone?
Yeah, so it's wood on the outside, and then there's a silicone liner, and I got this off of Amazon for like $12. This is a 3-pound mold. I've also seen 2-pound molds that look like essentially exactly the same. And mine, when I bought it, also came with 2 different styles of soap cutter, so it was a very good deal. And this is the mold that I started making soap with.
Cool. Is a 3-pound batch like standard, or is a 2-pound standard?
It depends on who you're looking at and where you're getting your recipes from. So for example, I started using this book. This is The Natural Soap Making Book for Beginners by Kelly Cable. It's a great book, and all of her recipes are 3-pound soaps. There's also this book, which is Simple and Natural Soap Making by Jan Berry. This is actually a very well-known soap making book. And her recipes tend to be 2 or 2.5 pounds. I should mention that wherever you get your recipe from, you can go to a soap calculator and you can enter in all of those soap values, and then you can scale your recipe up or down.
Oh, that is cool.
I was about to ask if they were linear, so yeah. Okay.
And I would always recommend, no matter where you're getting your recipe from, that you go ahead and plug it into a soap calculator and just check the amounts anyway, because typos can happen, right? So the difference between, 6 ounces of lye and 4 ounces of lye is going to be quite a lot in your finished soap. So just go ahead and double check any recipe, and you can start to devise your own soap recipes that way too, once you start to get an eye for what you're looking at. So this recipe is easily scalable because it's 65% of the oil weight is olive oil and 35% of the oil weight is coconut oil. So that's really easy to scale up or down if you know how much oil is going into your soap batch. Now I should say that we are not using, this is a 3-pound batch of soap. 3 pounds is 48 ounces. We're not using 48 ounces of oil because in the total batch, you have to take into account your lye water. And for this recipe, our lye water is at 35%. So that means that 35% of our 48 or 35% of 32, if you're doing a 2-pound batch, is going to be the lye water. So you would subtract that 35% from 48, and your remaining is the weight, the total weight of your oils. And then from there, you go and you figure out, well, I have this percentage of olive oil or this percentage of a different oil. And that's how you enter things into a soap calculator. All right. So now one thing that a lot of soap makers will do is kind of a last step is take some rubbing alcohol and you can spritz the top of the soap. And if there are any little bubbles sitting on the top of the soap, that will break them.
Oh.
So it will give you a smoother top usually, and it may help with something called soda ash. And soda ash is a completely harmless cosmetic thing that happens to soap. All it is some of the lye that's in your soap batter is interacting with the air. So here, for example, is a bar of soap that turned out ugly. The design didn't turn out the way I wanted it to, but it still smells nice. It's still soap. I'm still going to use it. And you can see that kind of weird color, how it looks different on the top. That is soda ash. And it will just rub right off with a damp cloth or the first time that you use the soap. It's a cosmetic variance. And it's totally fine. The soap works. It's good. So now I have my little milk carton, and I actually made this 2-pound batch on Thursday, and I poured it in the top, and you can see that a 2-pound batch doesn't quite fill up the milk container, or maybe you can't see because of the light.
That's better lighting right there.
Okay. So it's not going to totally fill up your container, and that's fine too. That's a little bit safer because this soap that I just made, it's going to remain pretty liquid for a while. Like I'm not going to move that around. I just pushed it gently to the other side of the table, and it's going to stay there probably until tomorrow. Like I won't move it until then. And during this initial saponification process, your soap might get very warm because a lot of things are happening chemically. When that's happening, there's another thing that your soap might do, and that's called gel phase. And that just means that it's getting really warm. It gets, the soap itself kind of turns almost translucent like a gel.
Okay.
And that is totally fine. It's fine if your soap goes through gel phase, so long as it doesn't get so hot that it expands and overflows your mold. Remember how we were talking about how hot processed soap can do that if you're not there to stir it and while it's cooking. The other thing is that if your soap goes through a partial gel, there's another cosmetic thing that might happen. And I don't know how well you can see. So this is a coffee soap that I had made, and it went through a partial gel phase. And there was sort of a slightly darker circle
Oh, yeah.
in the middle. So that's the part of the soap that went through gel phase. And it didn't quite reach out to the edges because the edges of the soap stayed cooler. And some people don't like that. I don't usually care. So it's going to be, if your soap does go through gel phase, it is going to be a little bit darker in color. And that may be something that, that you want specifically or that you don't want. If it's something that you don't want, you can put your soap in the fridge. That's not going to hurt it. It's still going to be soap at the end. And that's one way to try to head that off at the pass and make sure that your soap doesn't get too hot, particularly if you live in Atenveldt or another part of the country where it gets very hot during the summer. And even if you don't insulate your soap, you don't put towels around it or something like that, which people will do in warmer parts of the country if they want to in cooler parts of the country if they want to force their soap through a gel phase. Even if you don't do that, your soap can get pretty hot just sitting on the counter in Arizona in the summer. So yes.
If some people want pack towels around their soap and insulate it to force it into a gel phase, is there a benefit to putting it in a gel phase?
Yeah, the color is going to be a little bit darker. And if you force it to go through a gel phase, then you're making sure that it's not going through a partial gel phase and you don't have that dark circle. It's totally cosmetic. The soap is going to be fine, gel phase or no gel phase or partial gel phase, doesn't matter. Okay, so if you've got a little makeshift mold like this one is ready to come out and be cut. So I'm just going to put some paper down on my table. And I can kind of tell, sometimes soaps will take a long time to get hard, especially if you are using a lot of soft oils. Like my general recipe that I use has a lot of soft oils in it and some shea butter, and that means that it just takes longer for the soap to harden up. This one is going to be okay. You can see how if I pull the mold a little bit, it kind of pulls away from the soap. It's really fine. So sometimes, people can have soap ready to come out of the mold in 18 to 24 hours. And other times I've had soap where I've had to leave it in the mold for like 3 or 4 days. This one I made on Thursday. So here is an example of what can happen if it's too early.
Can you tip it a little towards you?
Yeah.
Kind of hard to see the white on white.
Okay. Well, the soap is sticking to the container.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
And it's ripping a little bit. Normally, you would just be able to rip this out and slice it up and then put it somewhere safe and cool for, 4 to 6 weeks. I usually turn my bars of soap once a week so that they cure evenly. So I'm going to go ahead and I was going to take this out and slice it up for you to see, but I'm going to go ahead and leave it for another couple of days. And I think that this is happening because we do actually have a lot of soft oils in this soap. It is mostly olive oil, and olive oil just takes a long time. So you just have to have some patience if you're doing cold process soap. There's not a lot of hands-on time to it, but there is a lot of waiting.
Gotcha.
So if I was going to cut it, this is one of my soap cutters. I would have just sliced it down into bars. And that is, I think, all that I had for you. What questions do you have?
Is there any essential oils that you've noticed cause issues with getting your soap to set up?
Not so much that I've noticed, but I know that there are folks out there, soap makers out there, who have been able to pay pretty good attention to those things. Sometimes people will make a note of that, and they'll say like, oh, this speeds up trace, which means it's going to make your soap harden up faster. That could have design implications for you, but it also means that it's probably going to be ready to come out of the mold a little bit faster, probably. And just, equally, there are soap fragrances or other additives that can slow down that process. It slows down trace, so it's going to stay more liquid for longer. I don't have a good list like that for you.
Okay.
But that is a thing. So it's one of those things where you just are doing a little bit of investigation and experimentation on your own. And that's part of the fun, I think, of soap making.
Right. In the previous video, there's a question in the chat window on what oil you could use instead of coconut when you have an allergy.
Yes. So a great substitute is palm kernel oil. So there are two different kinds of palm oil. There's palm oil, and then there's palm kernel oil. They come from the same plant. They come from different parts of the plant. They're considered a hard oil. They tend to be solid at room temperature, but palm kernel oil is a harder oil than palm oil. And it usually comes in flakes or, just sort of chunks, and you measure it out, and you can, I don't necessarily think that it has the exact same saponification value as coconut oil. So again, that's something that you're going to want to run through a soap calculator so that you can get the correct amount of lye into your soap. But if your soap called for 30% coconut oil, you certainly could use 30% palm kernel oil instead.
Oh,
nice.
I did see online one woman made soap using tallow and bacon grease.
So yeah, I haven't ever made a bacon grease soap. I'm a little bit afraid of that, but that is a thing you can do. It is basically lard,
Right.
There's salt in it, and things have happened to it. It's been processed differently than lard has been processed, but it is pig fat. So absolutely, you could use, I would probably look up some tutorials on that specifically and see if there's any, do I have to do any additional rendering to this bacon grease before I add it to my soap? The salt actually will help your soap harden up a little bit faster. You can put a little bit of table salt, maybe like a couple of teaspoons, into your lye water, and that's going to help it harden up faster. You can also buy a specific, and I just ordered some to try, and I forget exactly what kind of soap, it is a salt, it's a sodium, and you add it to your soap and it hardens your soap bars up faster. So I'm going to try that, and hopefully that will, because I'm impatient. I don't like to wait 4 days for my soap to come out of the mold. So hopefully that will help me be impatient.
Isn't that all of our goals?
Right? We want it now. Yeah, one of my friends recently was asking for his wife. He's like, "Oh, what would you need to make an oatmeal soap?" And I said, "Well, I have pretty much everything except some oatmeal." And he said, "But I could get that, and it would be ready in 4 to 6 weeks." And he didn't know that soap has a long curing time, and so he was very shocked to find out. It's like, I could start it now, but it's not going to have it for another month at least.
Right.
Someone in the comments asked if you could show the books that you mentioned again.
Yes, absolutely. And when I started making soap, I got these books. I was like, this is great because I want to make all natural soap with only all natural colors. So this is the one I started with. She has 3-pound recipes. It's very, very clear. She has information on like a fragrance wheel. So, if you're blending your own fragrances, you want a top note, you want a mid note, you want a base note. She has that information. She also has information on natural colorants to use in your soap. Because when I first started making soap, I was like, I'm going to have all natural soap. Nothing unnatural in my soaps. And then I started watching some soap makers on YouTube. Specifically, I started watching the Royalty Soaps YouTube channel. And I went over to the dark side faster than like 2 very fast things. I was like, yes, I want to use all of the colors. I want all of the smells. I want to do soap frosting and do all of these kinds of, so
fancy things.
Right. very modern things. Because at first I was like, this is going to be an A&S project someday, and it probably will still be an A&S project someday. But then all of a sudden, it's like, no, I want modern soaps with smells and colors and beautiful designs. So.
Oh, did your whiskey soap turn out?
Yeah, that was actually that blue and gray soap that I showed you. So it, design-wise, it did not turn out. But smell-wise and soap-wise, it is a soap, and it does smell good. So, and that was a fragrance oil that was supposed to smell like Greyjoy whiskey. So it was Game of Thrones inspired. It smells nice.
That's awesome.